know from the gymnostone study, provides an enormous amount of our building material and our fuel stock, okay, and our material for paper. Okay, this is where we don't make paper out of things like oak trees. Okay, we make them out of conifers of one description or another. Okay. Once you get either at a high latitude, okay, or a high altitude, there is typically insufficient liquid soluble precipitation and or lack of soil that is unfrozen for anything as large as a tree to be able to grow. We designate those habitats as tundra. And so the dominant plants you find in tundra are going to be mosses and low-growing plants, but no large vascular plants, because typically tundra is designated by a portion of the land at a very shallow depth under the surface that never thaws. Okay, so even in the summer, the top portion thaws, and below that the ground remains permanently frozen. It's referred to as permafrost. Okay? And that prevents the establishment of trees. And so you can look at a variety of places. That's a caribou, of course, designated here. But we have alpine tundra in the mainland United States. So if you go to the Rocky Mountains, right, and you go to, say, Rocky Mountain National Park, which is in Colorado, you can drive above the tree line into the alpine tundra there, where there are no longer any trees, there's a lot of low-growing plants, and instead of having caribou there, they've got elk. Instead, the big, large grazing animals in one description. Tundra covers a very, very large belt above the coniferous forest across the entire northern hemisphere, and then you come across tundra habitats at high elevation in all the mountain ranges. Okay? And of course, it's not reflected here. In most high mountain ranges, there is a place either there's a place above the tundra, which is nothing but bare rock and ice and snow, and nothing grows. Okay? And that's at varying heights depending where you are in the world. So, having given you that overview of our subdivision and major types, let's think about populations. First, definition. A population are members of the same species in the same area, all of which are actually or capable of breeding with one another. That's our definition of a population. And we did that way back when we did EVA at the beginning. Okay. So, where are populations located? Okay. There are obviously going to be concerns about space. Is there the appropriate area of habitat for the establishment of that population? And that may also be coupled with what we refer to as dispersion patterns. How individuals of a given species get from point A to point B. How do they manage to spread? How do they disperse? What are the limitations on their dispersal? Right? What limits them getting from one place to another? You've already had a bit of background on dispersal, and you know that many animals, for instance, their dispersal phase are the larvae, right? Eggs are laid, larvae hatch out. The larvae are the ones that actually do the moving around, particularly if you think of all those marine animals where the adults are sessile. They're stuck on a rock, right? And so dispersal is affected by the larvae. If you think of something like the example here of birds, okay, typically the dispersal phase is the adult winged animals that move from one place to another. There are also temporal concerns. That refers to time, when dispersal events happen. Right? So, where members of a population are may differ from season to season. Birds are another good example. There are many birds across the globe that spend summer in one portion of the globe and winter in another entirely different place. And they migrate annually, every year, back and forth between those two places, typically to take advantage of favourable climate. Okay. Characteristics that we need to think about in terms of a population. How big is it? What's the size of a population that is viable to enable that species to maintain itself? What controls the size of that population? If it's a prey species, are its predators exerting control over the size? If it's a parasite species, is the availability of hosts dictating how big the parasite population can get? If it's an organism that has different sexes, males and females, is there a distinction between numbers of males and females and numbers of males and females in a particular place. Okay? So there are a variety in animals, for instance, of different societal structures. So we may have a structure where one single male, for instance, is responsible for reproduction and fertilization of multiple females, or the reverse. Or we may have monogamy and pair bonding. There is also differences in age distribution. How old are the members of the population? Are there a lot of young ones, a lot of old ones? Are there different numbers in the different sections? When do the individuals in the population die? Okay? So if you think of humans, us in here, most humans in developed countries successfully survive childhood. Right? Our chance of surviving to become an adult and be reproductive is very, very good. And mortality rates only accelerate when you get to be old. And then they accelerate rapidly. So we're going to look at different ways in which survival occurs. If you think of an ascarid nematode laying 250,000 eggs every day, how many of those eggs are going to get to be adult nematodes? Very, very, very few. Juvenile mortality is very high. So all of these are factors to consider when we discuss populations. So let's think about dispersion as one example. We're going to think about a moss, okay, so a bryophyte. And these are all the levels at which you could choose to look at this particular species of moss. It's a moss in the genus Tetraphis. And so these are all the levels which a moss biologist might consider conducting studies to understand what's happening. The lowest level, for instance, might be to take, this is a moss that grows on trees. Not uncommon for moss on the bark and so on. So you may be looking at one clump of moss and just looking at those individuals and maybe analysing their genetic distinction on one clump on one tree. The next possible level is you can look at a whole colony of the moss on that entire tree stump. So you've got different patches in different places. Okay? Then you can go from that to an entire locality. You spread out a little more and you're going to look in that immediate area and look at a number of different clumps of moss. At the moment, you're positing they're all still members of the same population, meaning that they're actually or possibly reproducing with one another. Then you've got to remember how moss reproduce, right? Well, we've got alternation of generations, and there's a sporophyte and a gametophyte with different modes of reproduction. What's the dispersal phase of a moss? What disperses moss from one place to the next? Spores, right? The sporophyte generation produces those spores which can be wind distributed or water distributed, and generally that's what causes them to get from one place to the next. Then we can go to a whole drainage, looking at a whole river system. This happens to be a genus of moss. We can go from there to an entire portion of the continent. We can go there from a region, we can go to continental, we can go global. These are all the possible levels at which you could choose to study that particular species of moss. It makes ecology challenging, and typically no one ecologist is going to do all of that. Okay, that's a mind-boggling challenge, particularly if they're a graduate student trying to get a degree. Oh yeah, I'm going to study this species of moss at every level, from the individual all the way up to the global distribution. Okay, that'll take you a while. Now, the other thing to consider in the landscape, when you actually start to map where something occurs, does every organism show different patterns of dispersal and actual arrangement in the landscape? And the answer is no. Okay? So let's consider different possibilities. Okay? If you think of fish, and you think of a single species of fish, so that's some sort of mullet of some description or another. A lot of oceanic and water fish occur in large clumps. They occur in shoals, where there are a lot of individuals, maybe millions, all occurring in close proximity to one another, but most of the space doesn't contain those fish. In other words, their dispersal is incredibly clumped. Many of the individuals in small spots and most of the landscape absent